Welcome to this edition of Garden Myths and Home Remedies, Believe or Bust. I'm Diana Alfuth, Horticulture Outreach Specialist for UW-Madison's Division of Extension. Often you hear about various yard and garden practices and home remedies that you should use, but it can be difficult to know if it's really a good idea, what will and what won't work, and sometimes these things will actually cause more harm than good. This series of programs is to address some of these myths and home remedies and the science behind them so that you can make the best decisions for your yard and garden maintenance. Today, we're talking about a common and long recommended practice about the need to burn tent caterpillars. With me today is PJ Liesch, Director of the Insect Diagnostics Lab at UW-Madison. Welcome, PJ.
Good to be here, Diana.
So what we're talking about are tent caterpillars, and you can see here a picture of a tent that we commonly see in spring, late summer, and fall. So can you just describe what we're looking at here?
Sure. So what we're seeing in this picture is a silken structure produced by eastern tent caterpillars. And just as a little bit of background, when you think about creatures that produce silk, maybe spiders come to mind, but many caterpillars can actually produce silk from glands that they have associated with their body. But in a lot of cases, the caterpillars either won't produce a whole lot of silk or it's used only in very particular situations. But there are a few caterpillars that can be common on landscape plants in Wisconsin that produce large amounts of silk, and two species in particular that stand out we can see on this slide. We have the eastern tent caterpillar, and then there's also a fall webworm, and these can be common at different times of the year. So to elaborate a little bit more about these, I mentioned the two species, eastern tent caterpillar and then the fall webworm. So let's take a peek at the eastern tent caterpillar first. This is the so-called tent caterpillar that can be very, very common during the spring months. It is a species that overwinters as eggs, and then in the spring months, usually around late April or maybe early May, depending on how warm of a spring we have, the caterpillars emerge and they start feeding, and they will produce a silken tent. Now, we can see from the photo, they have a pretty distinctive appearance. Eastern tent caterpillars can get close to 2 inches long when mature. They're dark colored, but they have a white mid-dorsal stripe, or this white stripe running down the middle of their back. But if you look at that white stripe, it's bordered with a yellowish orange color. So that's a very distinctive appearance. And again, they're going to be producing this silken tent that they hang out inside of for protection. So that's what the caterpillars look like. Again, they're active in spring. Eventually, they will pupate and transform into a brownish moth, which is active more during the summer months. And so folks often may not recognize that particular life stage, the adult moth, or may not realize that it's even out there doing its thing. So those adults will be mating, laying more eggs, and then those eggs would hatch the following spring. So only one generation per year. So that's what the eastern tent caterpillar looks like. It's also important to point out that eastern tent caterpillar has a fairly picky eating habit, if you will. They seem to really like certain plants like fruit trees, so apple and pear, plum, and peach, things like that. In the landscape realm, we're talking more about ornamental cherry trees, perhaps, or a very common one would be crab apple. So we can often identify these just based on the host plant and the time of the year. The second species is the fall webworm. And as you can guess from the name, it can be a common insect in fall, but they can actually get started a little bit earlier than that. Sometimes I get reports of my first fall webworm cases in July. So really mid to late July onwards, so month of August and especially September can be a month where fall webworms can be very easy to spot up in trees. Now, the caterpillars for fall webworms are going to be a bit smaller than eastern tent caterpillar. They're usually a little over an inch long, and their color can actually vary quite a bit. Sometimes they're dark, sometimes they're almost entirely pale. Often when I see them, they tend to be pale, and they have a pretty shaggy appearance. They have these long hair-like structures called setae, and so we can see in that photograph in the bottom right-hand corner, they do have this very kind of fuzzy-looking appearance to them. So this species overwinters as pupae, and the adult moths, which are essentially entirely pale white, are active during the late spring, early summer period. They're laying eggs, and then those eggs hatch during the mid to late summer months. And so we end up with the caterpillars that time of the year. Months like August and September is the key period for these. Another note about the feeding habits of fall webworm, they can feed on a very, very wide range of plants. They do produce those silken tents, but keep in mind, we're seeing those silken tents later in the season, whereas eastern tent caterpillar is during the spring months.
Okay, so these caterpillars, they're basically leaf eaters, and they can be pretty dramatic, especially as these tents get bigger. And these caterpillars climb out of those tents during the day and they eat leaves, and that can be pretty alarming for people. And so there is the recommendation that has been around for a long, long time that these are really a severe pest, that it's going to kill the tree, that you have to burn them. And so there is a belief that you need to set fire to that tent and kill all the caterpillars or they will kill your tree. But that's really not true. The caterpillars do eat the leaves off, but I want to remind everyone that at the base of every leaf, there is a bud. So if we look on the picture on the right here, you can see on every tree at the base of the leaf, there's a little bud there. And that bud is just a latent bud sitting there. It doesn't sprout unless it's needed. So what happens is when these caterpillars eat all the leaf tissue out, they don't bother those buds. So those buds will break out and the tree will be just fine later on. In the case of the eastern tent caterpillars, on the left picture here, you can actually see that a lot of this leaf tissue is gone because the caterpillars have been eating it. But by June or so, these latent buds on those trees will start breaking out and your tree will be fully relieved by later in the summer. In the case of the fall webworm, those leaves can get eaten up, but the next spring, these buds will sprout, and so there will be new leaves on the tree. So these caterpillars really are pretty harmless to these trees. And so you can do a whole lot more damage and disfiguring of your tree if you burn these tents. And certainly if you set fire to them while the tents are still on the tree, you're going to cause damage and burn the tissue on that branch and kill off that branch. If you prune the branch out first before you burn it, you're also disfiguring that tree, and that may not be in the best pruning plan for the tree for removing that branch. So they really aren't that serious. And my recommendation often is to just take a stick and destroy that nest, and they will become bird food. And if you do absolutely nothing, it'll just run its course and the tree will be just fine. But PJ, what about controlling these things? What are the best approaches?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, Diana. And as you mentioned, in the grand scheme of things, they really don't cause that much overall damage. You have to look at the situation a little bit. Perhaps you have a very recently planted young crabapple where we may not be able to tolerate as much damage. That's kind of a different scenario. But if we have a large, well-established tree, even if you do nothing, those trees are going to be completely fine in the long run. Again, as you said, with the eastern tent caterpillar feeding in spring, the plants have backup buds. And if you get some defoliation, they can put out another batch of leaves and they should be fine in the long run. If you do have these in your yard, there are a couple options. As you had mentioned, there's that notion that folks need to burn these, which is just not true. There's no real need to do that. And also, as you suggested, that can cause more harm than good, both in the physical damage to the tree. That can also affect the overall look and form of trees if we are burning things or pruning them out. But also from another plant health aspect, there are certain trees that we really want to hold off on pruning until kind of colder periods of the year due to disease concerns, fire blight and oak wilt and things like that. So we really don't want to prune unless we have to for something like this. A few options though, if that silken tent is in a spot where you can reach it, it's very easy to take a stick and kind of poke it out of there and physically remove that tent. If you're not squeamish, you could take a pair of gardening gloves or even your bare hands and grab that tent, pull it out of there, drop it into a container of soapy water, and that would be a way to dispose of them as well. So physically removing that tent is a very simple approach. Again, that tent is going to have to be in a spot where you can reach it and it is accessible to you. A few other options, and again, doing nothing is is a completely fine course of action in many cases. If it's maybe a younger, smaller, newer tree where you just can't tolerate a lot of damage, there are some spray options. A good organic option is Bacillus thuringiensis, or commonly called BT. There's a strain of BT, Bacillus thuringiensis kerstachii, or BTK, that can work against caterpillars, and that can work against small eastern tent caterpillars, fall webworms. A catch is that BTK works best against very young caterpillars just out of the egg. If the caterpillars are large and reaching maturity, the BT treatment is not going to work very well. The way this would be used is you would have to spray it primarily on the foliage that they may be feeding on. So it's essentially a protectant. The caterpillars would feed on it and it would affect them that way as well. A few other low impact options could be things like insecticidal soap or a lightweight horticultural oil. Those would work by direct contact. So by spraying the caterpillars directly, we could control them. Otherwise, there are a number of conventional insecticides as well that you and I can get at the hardware store or garden center. These could be applied again to the foliage to serve as a kind of protective coating so that if the caterpillars go to feed on those leaves, they will be impacted by those pesticides. So a number of options out there, including some organic and low impact options.
All right, that's great. So bottom line is these things really aren't that serious. Even though the tents look pretty dramatic, and yes, they can eat a lot of leaves off of trees. For most trees, except for young, newly planted ones, you probably don't have to do anything. Just removing the tent and exposing the caterpillars to the dangers of the world that affect caterpillars is probably the easiest thing to do. Otherwise, there are some other controls, as you mentioned, if you really think they're necessary. But burning, probably would never recommend that. These things just aren't that serious. They're not a human health hazard. They're not even really much of a hazard to your tree. So thanks, PJ, for helping out here and describing these tent caterpillars and the need to burn. That's one myth that we are busting here that has been around a long time, but is not recommended. So thanks for listening, and everyone have a great day.